Good morning everyone, welcome to our small footprint. My name is Nyssa, and if you're new here, we are a family of 8 who live off-grid in Australia. Currently doing a run of videos about my daily food prep and things like that after doing 6 weekly grocery hauls. So this is day 3 of food prep. There's normally around about 7 to 10 days of fairly intense canning, preserving, prepping, freezer meals and all that sort of thing after a 6-week grocery haul that needs to be done to make sure that all the food that's in the fridge gets used appropriately and put somewhere that's going to be able to be used afterwards. So whereas the meat needs to be done before it's used by dates, either to be cooked and stored or to be canned or to be put in the freezer or whatever else. So there's normally about 7 to 10 days that it takes me to get through everything. This month is a little bit skewed because our secondary produce fridge is not working. It still isn't working. We keep on troubleshooting, but it's just we can't get it to work. I don't think we're going to. The fridge space is currently staying cool but not cold, which is we've got carrots and stuff in there, so it'll at least prolong the life of those for a bit, but it's not great. So because of the lack of a second fridge or a produce fridge, it's sort of altered the way that I am having to deal with food, but we're getting through and I'm sharing what we're doing. So this, as I said, this is day 3 of food prep post the 6-week grocery haul, which would have been Tuesday's food prep because I'm a couple of days behind on these videos. Normally I try and get them out the day after I do stuff because it's fresh in my mind and all the rest of it, but I'm having to write fairly extensive notes to remember what I got done by looking at the video that I'm going to put it with at the moment because of just the way things are working, but that's fine. So this is day 3 and I got the mushrooms done before they went bad, though they were starting to go a little bit, but that's life. Finished canning up that plum sauce and we made KFC for dinner. So going to share all of that as I did it and enjoy. Thanks guys. Alrighty, we started the day off with sourdough English muffins. I had made the dough for these the night before. I'd mixed it all up and then it's an overnight proof. Now the thing is, I've mentioned before that I haven't been leaving things out on the bench for the overnight proofs because we've got bush rats, which are like little possum type creatures. They're a protected species in Australia and they are hitting the patio for any sort of food scraps that are left behind. They don't chew through packaging generally speaking, but the smell of dough seems to appeal to them, so whatever. So I stuck it in the fridge to do overnight, but it's the fridge that isn't working, thinking that it'd be cool enough, but obviously the dough heated up, the fridge heated up anyway. It was pretty overproof by the morning, but I wasn't going to waste it. The English muffin dough has some milk products in it, so it has coconut milk is what we use, and which means it's not real good to turn into something else. So like if I've got an overproofed bread dough, I'd tend to turn that into like a focaccia, but with milk in it, that's not really what it's for. So I decided that I was just going to power through doing the English muffins. I don't do round English muffins. It's a lot of work rolling it out, cutting rounds, re-rolling it, cutting rounds. I just do square. So all I did was I very gently patted the dough out into a big rectangle and cut it into squares and gently placed them in the pan, gently maneuvered them around. They were a little less fluffy than normal and a little misshapen in the shape, like some bits were a little skewed. They weren't square as such, but that again, it doesn't really matter. They cooked up nicely. I cook them in a cast iron pan. A little bit of semolina will make the crust nice and crunchy, so I put them in the pan, put a lid on it, and then it takes sort of 6 to 10 minutes depending on the temperatures you're using per side for it to cook all the way through, and then just put them on a rack to cool and just kept on doing batches. So I did a double batch of this recipe. I do a large amount of them because they toast up really nicely as the next day or whatever. So did a big double batch of them, cooked them all up and got them, and then we had them for breakfast. So for breakfast we had fried eggs with bacon and mayo, and I think we had some apple butter barbecue and that sort of thing on English muffins for breakfast or lunch or whatever you want to call it. The next thing I had to do was get that plum sauce in the jars. So I had put the plum sauce in the fridge overnight because I didn't get to canning it yesterday. So I put it on the stove and I brought it up to a simmer for 10 minutes just to make sure that it was all heated through and ready to go. I used various size reusable glass jars to can this up. Because it's the first time I've made it, I'm canning it in fairly small amounts because this is not going to be a pouring sauce. It's not going to be a dipping sauce or a pouring sauce. It's going to be a marinade or a glaze or something that is used in like with stock and a bit of cornstarch to make it sort of that sticky sort of a sauce, things like that. So I don't think I need large quantities of it. So I made it in smaller jars and we'll see how we go. Can always change my mind next time if I make it another time, but it's always good to start with a smaller size jar in my opinion. And then you learn, a bit like the baked beans. I did the baked beans the other day. Small jars, have quickly figured out that the kids open 2 or 3 per meal, so I need to do them in larger jars. But for this sauce, I started off in the smaller jars to give it a go. I'm also a bit lazy about removing labels just to, put it out there. So when you're processing these jars, the labels tend to sort of come off. So I kind of find it unnecessary to spend the time to scrape all the labels off when the first time I process the jars, most of the labels come sliding off anyway, and it's not going to affect anything. So, a bit lazy there, but that's what I do. I filled all the jars as usual and wiped all the edges with the white vinegar like normal, using paper towel or a lint-free cloth of some sort. I like to wipe the inside of the lids as well, as I said, with a bit of vinegar, just because of where we live and everything else, and place the lids on firmly. Lug lids, you want the lids on a bit firmer than you would a ring on a mason jar. I think I said this last video, but a bit firmer than you put a lid on a mason jar, but not so hard that you're going to skip the threads on the lid. So nice and firm. I wanted to show you different size jars with varied lids here too, because I get asked all the time about getting these lids and stuff. So I buy lids in bulk, and I buy them in a variety of different sizes. So I've got 4 different size jars here basically. I've got a pesto jars, which are about 190 mils, and they use a 48 or a 53 mil lid depending on the brand of the pesto jar. And then I've got the Valcom jars, which is the green curry paste that I use. These use a 58 mil lid, and then the standard 240 mil jars use a 63 mil lid, which is sort of a standard size lid. But you can also see that the strawberry jam jar here, which is quite a lot larger than the 240 mils. I think they're 375 maybe, because the molasses jars are the same size, and they also use a 63 millimeter lid. So it does vary between differences. You find that like a tomato paste jar, like a Legos tomato paste jar, tends to use a 70 mil lid, and then your 1 litre jars have a tendency to use the 82 mil lids. So I tend to buy bulk in all different sizes and have them in their separate containers so that I have them all available, so I can reuse whichever jars I have available to me and make sure that I have the necessary lids for. I put them all in the pressure canner because I'm going to use it as a steam canner again. So rack in the bottom, jars in the canner, 3 quarts of water minimum. You don't want the water to cover the jars. It has to only be up to about the shoulder of the jars. So you do have to adapt your water quantity a little bit depending on the size of the jars. Because the jars are only small, the processing time is fairly low too. So 3 quarts of water will be plenty to get it through that processing time. If you're doing large jars and the processing time is up to the 40-45 minutes, then you're going to need a bit more water in the bottom because you're going to have enough water to create steam for that entire time. These jars are fine to have 3 quarts of water. It just came up to the shoulder on the jars. Put the lid on it, did all the normal. Once the steam is blowing hard, the safety valve is up, then I started my timer and let them go, turn it off, let it cool, pull them out. All the normal process. The next thing I had to start work on was mushrooms. So I'd cleaned and picked through them all. I'd taken the stalks off because the stalks were the bits that seemed to go a bit sort of spongy because they weren't in optimal temperature. So I picked through them all, cleaned them all, took all the stems off, and then cut the cups into slices. I wouldn't normally take the stalks off. I'd normally just can them up as well because it's all just mushroom, but they were a bit soggy, so I decided not to. I sliced all the cups up and then placed them in the pot with lemon juice and water, a cup of lemon juice and then water to get them submerged, and simmer them until they were all wet, a few minutes, and then drained the liquid off. I was looking at whether this liquid could be used in something because it's water with lemon juice and mushroom stock in it basically. I don't know what you'd use it for though, but I don't see how you couldn't. I'd wash the mushrooms beforehand, so it's not like they'd be dirt. I don't know. But I used it in the garden. I fed some plants with it because once it had cooled down, because I just wasn't sure whether it would be usable in anything in particular. I did cut all the stems up and put them in a freezer bag. They can be used in bolognese or something that they're going to be mushed up in and cooked in anyway. There was nothing wrong with them. There was no mold or anything else. They were just a little bit moist, a little bit spongy, just not very pleasant. So I cut all them up and put them in a freezer bag so that I could use them for another project that needed mushrooms in it. I probably would have dehydrated them if I could run my dehydrator at the moment, but we're having a little bit of a problem with our secondary solar array as well at the moment. The inverter is throwing a code, which is great, so I can't run the dehydrator at the moment. I then mixed the brine up, which is olive oil, apple cider vinegar, some salt and some herbs, and brought that up to a boil, and then turned it down to a gentle simmer so it's hot when I'm filling the jars. There is a whole video about making these marinated mushrooms, so I'm pretty sure all the ratios and a link to the recipes in that video. I'll try and remember to put that in the bottom, but we all know how well I remember that kind of thing. Once that was done, I started filling the jars. So again, I've shown this in the previous video, diced onion and garlic in the bottom and a few peppercorns, then filled firmly with the mushroom pieces. Once the jars were all full, then we're going to pour the hot brine over the mushrooms. So you're going to pour the brine over to the shoulder initially, and then you're going to go through and you're going to debubble all of it because there's lots of air pockets in amongst all those mushrooms, and then top up the brine to the point that it's at the correct headspace at the shoulder of the jar. Once you've got them all done, you're going to clean the rims with white vinegar, clean the lids with white vinegar, and then put the lids on. I found these jars in a box. I didn't realize I still had a new box of these jars. So these are 240ml jars with 63ml lids, which is nice and convenient. I also found a little friend in that box, so I'll put a picture here in what I found him there too. I had a bit of spare garlic and onion and brine, and I also had room in the canner. So what I did was I cut up some extra garlic and I filled a couple of jars with just the garlic and the onion. I then poured the hot marinade over the garlic and onion. I've been wanting to try the marinated garlic a few times, but I haven't had the opportunity to do it. And I've been a bit concerned about wasting garlic and not liking it. So this worked out really well. I've got 2 jars there. I'll leave it a week to mellow. We'll give it a go. And it might be something I do with some garlic in the future. It has good reviews doing marinated garlic, so we'll see how we go. I'm not a huge fan of straight pickled garlic. So it's fine in cooking and stuff, but yeah, I can buy cheap jars from Costco of that kind of thing. I processed them in the pressure canner as a steam canner as well, topped up the water as appropriately needed for those jars after the water that had evaporated from the previous batch, but it also brought the temperature of the water down a little bit to be more even to the jar temperature. For dinner, we did faux KFC chicken tenders. So I mixed up my spice blend in my little personal Tri-Best blender and then poured it into a few cups of flour in a jar and mixed it. I made a bulk batch of this up so that I could shake the jar up, and then I've got this seasoned flour to use for anything that I want to bread in a hurry, rather than having to make it up any time that I want to do it. I do the same as what I did yesterday with the chicken. I pulled a fresh tray of chicken out. I filleted the chicken for the KFC tenders and then diced up what was left and stuck it in a vacuum seal bag for in the freezer, and then that way there's a kilo of chicken in the freezer for a curry for later on in the month, and we used 1.5 kilos on the chicken tenders. We only do this KFC sort of once every 6-week period. Because it's a breaded chicken dish, we use more chicken than we would for other meals. So it's one of those things, it's a bit like hamburgers with the mince. We only do it once because it uses a large quantity of meat for that meal. So I did 1.5 kilos up of the chicken, and it'll probably mean that we'll have leftovers tomorrow. It really depends on the kids. Sometimes they eat it all in one sitting. We all go through, the 8 of us go through it. Sometimes we don't. It just really depends. So I bread the chicken by dipping it in the seasoned flour, dipping it in an egg, and then dipping it in the seasoned flour again, really well coated. And then I cook it in about 1 centimetre of lard with a splash of olive oil in it. It's not an excessive amount of fat, but it's definitely not a low fat dish, but you want enough fat in there so that the flour sort of flakes around it a bit like a KFC tender, but not deep fried. So the flour flakes out a bit and you get all these crunchy bits around the edges of the meat. It's really tasty. As I said, we only do once every 6 weeks, so I'm not so concerned about the use of the lard and that in it there. I cooked off about the 1.5 kilos of chicken, as I said, and left the other kilo in the chicken. That's not quite accurate, is it? The other kilo of chicken in the freezer for a curry or whatever later in the month, as I said. So that's all just diced up and then frozen. So it's really easy to defrost once it's diced up because it doesn't take much time, which is why I like to do it that way when I'm freezing it. I've said before, I'm not a huge fan of freezing raw chicken because then you've got to defrost it before you're ready to cook it, and I much prefer having cooked stuff because I can just really quick defrost it, heat it, and then I've got it to eat. So it makes sense that way to do it rather than having the raw chicken in the freezer. So we served it up for dinner how I like to eat it that initial time that we eat it, and that was the chicken tenders with mashed potatoes, steamed veg, and a really generous helping of gravy. So it's not exactly the healthiest meal in the world, but it is super tasty and we really enjoy it when we do have it. And it's a bit of a treat with the chicken. As I said, it uses a far more amount of chicken to do this than it would to make a big batch of curry or something like that. And there was leftovers this particular day, so there was quite a generous amount of leftovers as well, for which will go towards lunch for whatever we have tomorrow. So that will be really nice, and then we can have and it heats up really nicely too. You just fry it off a little bit in a pan and it goes a bit crispy, or you can put it in the oven, whatever you choose to do. So it's a really, it's a bit of a treat meal, but we enjoy it. So that was dinner for that day. So I got the plum sauce done, the mushrooms done, and we processed another tray of chicken, and that's sort of it. I've been spending the morning doing admin every day this week, and it's really cutting into my food prep time. I'm having to use my time very carefully. So anyway, that's what we got done today, and I will see you again when I get the next one out tomorrow. Maybe we'll see how we go. Thanks for joining me again, guys. See you later.